Had I been in a hunting area, I would have shot him at this point. Being in the national park, I kept shouting and hoped he would change his mind. At about 4 paces, he shook his head. No, he wasn't interested in stopping. But by the time his head steadied to permit an accurate shot, he was way too close. His head was perhaps 20 yards from me, and the tips of his tusks were considerably closer. I stepped back as I fired a Norma Solid. I lost my footing on the broken ground and went down just as the elephant collapsed in mid-stride. It was a perfect brain shot, and he went down instantly. But 3.5 to 4 tons of elephant moving at close to 25 miles an hour has some momentum. So he slid forward, arriving at the same spot on the ground as I did at about the same time. I have no idea what hit me, the tusk or the trunk, but something did and broke my left forearm. At first I didn't notice. I hit the ground, the elephant hit me. I rolled and came up with the rifle reloaded and ready for action. It wasn't necessary. The elephant was dead, and then I noticed just how sore my arm was. Don Heath, Unexpected Product Test, 4 May 2012. Hi there, this is John McAdams, and you are listening to episode 375 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. Being that this is episode 375, I feel like I am basically required to discuss what some consider the quote-unquote best all-around big game hunting cartridge ever designed, the 375 Holland & Holland Magnum. Furthermore, I will compare that cartridge to another round some people also feel is a contender to that same title, the 9.3x62mm. I have rifles chambered in both. I have hunted extensively with both. I really like both rounds, and I will discuss the pros, cons, and recommended use cases for both the 9.3x62 and the 375 H&H with you in detail in this episode. I will share a few stories involving both cartridges, as well as some information on how they each performed in ballistic gel with you today. And yes, I will reveal what cartridge Don Heath was using in that story I just referenced. Now, furthermore, a person with the username CJHCBR549 left a review for the podcast on Apple. And he said, in one podcast last year or two with one of your African colleagues, you two discussed 2 Ruger rifles and which rifles were better for heavy-hitting cartridges. Which model did you prefer? I appreciate the review on the podcast, sir, and it is possible you are referring to an interview I did with Kevin Robertson back in 2020, and that was episode 106, if I recall correctly. In that episode, Kevin talked about the old Ruger M77 Mk II and how he considered that rifle far superior to the newer model M77 Hawkeye. I think Kevin was both right and wrong with his assessment of those rifles, and to be fair, Ruger has made some adjustments to the Hawkeye since Kevin initially tested it. I think this was 2006-2007. Now, I own both of those rifles, and they just so happen to be in 9.3x62 and 375 H&H. I've shot and hunted with both quite a bit, so I can talk about my experiences with each of those rifles with you here today, along with my detailed comparison and analysis of the 375 H&H and the 9.3x62. Before we get started with that, make sure you are on my email list. And if you like the podcast, you will love the emails I send out every weekday about hunting, shooting, ballistics, etc. Sign up at the link in the show notes or at biggamehuntingpodcast.com/ebook. Now let's get started talking about the 9.3x62 and the 375. First, I will give a brief overview of both cartridges, then we will dive into how they compare to each other. We'll start with the 9.3. If we rewind back into the early 1900s, Germany had several colonies in Africa. For instance, they had a colony in what was then known as Southwest Africa and is now known as Namibia, and another colony called Tanganyika, which eventually merged with Zanzibar to become the country we now know as Tanzania. In any case, there were lots of German settlers in both of those colonies. They needed rifles that were reasonably priced, reliable, and effective on the whole spectrum of animals they would encounter in both places. They needed something that would work great on antelope for the pot, that would work well for defending their livestock against lion and leopard, and would also be effective on thick-skinned, dangerous game like buffalo and elephant. That is a very tall order. Now, during that time, double rifles still reigned supreme for use on dangerous game. Bolt-action magazine rifles did exist, but they were only available in smaller bore cartridges like the 7mm Mauser. But like I said, there was that demand for a more powerful cartridge suitable for all-around Africa hunting use that would function in a standard Mauser 98 rifle. Well, a gentleman named Otto Bach designed a cartridge he called the 9.3x62mm that checked all of those boxes, and he released it in 1905. That was actually the year before the 30-06 came on the scene. This cartridge came out during that transition to smokeless powder. Now, while the 9.3x62 was not designed by Peter Paul Mauser, that company did immediately pick up the new round, and thus the 9.3x62 has been long associated with the Mauser name. The 9.3x62 fires a 9.3mm or .366 caliber bullet and does not have a parent case. It has a case that is rimless, 62 millimeters long, very similar to but not directly related to the 8mm Mauser or the 30-06. It has very slightly different case dimensions, and specifically the 9.3 has a slightly smaller rim but slightly larger case head diameter. Now, the 8mm Mauser has a 57mm long case, then the 30-06 has a 63mm long case, while the 9.3x62 has a 62mm long case. Now, some hunters have resized 30-06 brass to use in 9.3x62 rifles, but that is not ideal. It will work in a pinch if you can't get anything else, and that's why those guys were doing it. But after a couple of firings, the case will develop a bulge just above the case head. Now, the initial load for the cartridge used a 286-grain bullet fired at 2,175 feet per second. Modern 9.3 loads will fire a 286-grain bullet at 2,350 feet per second. That works out to around 3,500 foot-pounds of energy. It is possible to get a little bit hotter ammunition for the cartridge. For instance, Buffalo Bore has a load firing that 286-grain bullet at 2,450 feet per second for just over 3,800 foot-pounds of energy. Now, the 9.3x62 has virtually identical ballistics to the older 9.3x74R. That is a rimmed cartridge developed around 1900, but it was designed for use in a more expensive falling block, double rifle, or combination gun. Now, cartridges designed for those type of firearms generally operate at a lower pressure than those designed for bolt actions. And it was not unusual for companies, especially back then, to develop two nearly identical cartridges: a higher pressure rimless round for use in a bolt action rifle and a lower pressure round for use in a break action. That was the case with the 350 Rigby, for instance. They made a rimless round and a cartridge with a rim that was otherwise identical in size that fired the same bullet a little slower. In this case, the 9.3x62 was physically smaller overall than the 9.3x74, but it operated at a higher pressure and had identical ballistics. Now, while the cartridges share a similar name and they have essentially identical ballistics, they're not related at all. But anything that you can do with one of them, you can do with the other one, and the only difference is the type of rifles they are both available in. The 9.3x62 is an excellent plains game hunting round. It also worked really well on dangerous game, buffalo, hippo, elephant, rhino, etc. It was the first cartridge really capable of and suitable for all-around work on all manner of game like that also worked in a reasonably priced bolt-action rifle. Like I said, this was in the early days of smokeless powder and in the early days of bolt-action rifles. And at that point, if you were using a bolt-action rifle, you really only had access to more specialized rounds like the 7mm Mauser. Rounds like that were great for deer and antelope, but they were really too small for use on thick-skinned game. And then you also had bigger bore rifles like the 500 and 5.77 Nitro Express that were great on bigger game, but weren't practical for use on antelope and deer. And furthermore, those cartridges were not available in bolt-action rifles. So here you have this cartridge that splits the difference between the 7 Mauser, for instance, and the 500 Nitro. It'll work well for everything, and it's also available in a reasonably priced, widely available bolt-action rifle. As you can imagine, it was a really big hit almost from the beginning. And like I said, it checked all of those boxes that those colonists, farmers, etc., in German colonies in Africa, but it also expanded to elsewhere in Africa, really wanted and needed at the time. But unfortunately for the 9.3, the hard times that befell Germany after World War I also hurt the popularity and availability of the 9.3x62. Now, the 375 H&H, and we'll talk more about it in a minute, was designed as a direct response to the 9.3, and indeed, that cartridge directly benefited from the changing geopolitical structure of the world during the middle of the 20th century at the expense of the German 9.3x62. In fact, things got so bad for the 9.3 that it nearly died in the middle of the 20th century. There were a good number of rifles floating around out there in that chambering, but ammo became darn near impossible to find for a long time. Now, some hunters in Africa especially loved the cartridge so much and were so desperate for components that they would do things like swedge down a 270 grain 375 caliber bullet and then pair it with resized 30-06 brass just so they could use their rifles. The results were barely adequate and came along with all sorts of downsides. Now, things have happily changed more recently, and the fortunes of the 9.3x62 are on an upswing. Ammo and components are available from several American and European manufacturers as I record this. I have used this cartridge extensively. As a matter of fact, I purchased a CZ550 in 9.3x62 as a young adult. It was actually one of the very first rifles I ever purchased. I hunted with that rifle for a couple of seasons, sold it, and then bought a left-handed Ruger Hawkeye in 9.3x62. I took that rifle on a hunt to Africa, shot a buffalo, an elephant, all sorts of plains game with it. I also used it pretty extensively in the United States as well. I've taken a black bear with it and a couple of deer and hogs and all of that stuff. Now, I have talked about that Hawkeye on the show in the past, and I'll share some more detailed stories about it later in this episode. But for now, we need to move on to the 375 H&H. Now, this was a British cartridge introduced in 1912 by Holland & Holland. This is a belted Magnum cartridge. Like the 9.3x62, the 375 does not have a parent case. Now, also, like the 9.3, the 375 H&H was designed for all-around use, to include in Africa, but it was not limited just to hunting in Africa. In fact, it was designed as a British response to the German 9.3, and the British wanted their own all-around hunting cartridge, also designed for use in a magazine rifle. Now, designers at Holland & Holland built a cartridge called the 400 375 H&H, also known as the 375 Veloplex. They intended that cartridge for all-around use in Africa. That cartridge is best known today for being the first belted cartridge, but it quickly fell by the wayside when its performance of a 270 grain 375 caliber bullet fired at about 2,175 feet per second afield did not quite live up to expectations on really big game. And to add insult to injury, the 9.3x62 dramatically outperformed it. The British knew they needed to take another stab at the problem, so they decided to build another, physically larger 375 caliber cartridge. Designers at Holland & Holland surmised the fantastic sectional density of the 286 grain bullet the 9.3x62 fired, .305, was one of the reasons that cartridge performed so well on big game. So they bumped bullet weight from 270 to 300 grains for their new cartridge to match the 9.3 in the sectional density department. Now, the British Empire encompassed parts of both the Indian subcontinent and large chunks of Africa at the time. Both of those regions are very hot. The British primarily used cordite, which is very temperature sensitive as a propellant during that time. So they optimized their new cartridge for reliability by giving it a highly tapered case and a shallow shoulder to ensure smooth feeding and to minimize the chances a fired cartridge would stick in the chamber in case they encountered excessive pressure. Now, head spacing was difficult with such a highly tapered case with such a small shoulder, so H&H designers applied the principle of a belt, first seen on the 400-375 cartridge I just mentioned, to the new 375 H&H. Now, a belted cartridge uses the same general idea as a rim on a cartridge like a 303 British or a 3030, but it is not quite as obtrusive and it lends itself to better reliability. Now, don't get me wrong, rimmed cartridges like the 303 or a 3040 Krag can be made to feed reliably in a bolt action, but that design is more prone to getting hung up than a rimless cartridge or a belted round. So what am I talking about with this belt? Basically, just picture a normal cartridge case that does not have a rim on it, and it has a thicker portion right at the case head. Almost like you put a metal belt around the outside of the cartridge. That's all it is. It's just big enough to facilitate good head spacing. Now, Africa and India contain numerous dangerous animals, literally lions, tigers, and bears, along with elephant, buffalo, hippo, etc. This is, of course, in addition to various species of antelope and or deer between those various places. Plus, especially in parts of what is now India, Pakistan, and Nepal, there were considerable mountain hunting opportunities for British sportsmen. So designers built the cartridge to give the hunter something reliable enough to trust your life on and powerful enough to cleanly kill the really big, dangerous game, but without being excessively powerful or having too much recoil for use on antelope or deer, and with enough velocity to allow the hunter to reach out a bit on a hunt in the mountains. They released 3 different loads for the cartridge initially. A 235 grain bullet at 2,800 feet per second for the mountains, a 270 grain bullet at 2,650 feet per second for antelope and deer, and a 300 grain bullet at about 2,500 feet per second for dangerous game. Now, the 375 H&H was an excellent design, and its builders achieved their goals with it. Even so, it was not an instant success. The 9.3 still worked just fine, and it also had the edge over the British round in terms of rifle and ammo availability along with pricing. It also didn't recoil quite as much either. Now, like I mentioned earlier, that all started to change after World War I. The Germans lost all of their overseas colonies after World War I. Furthermore, though the 375 was a British-designed cartridge, it also gained a foothold in the USA during that time frame as well in the 1920s and 30s. That cartridge is more than is necessary for hunting game like deer or elk, but a lot of people used it to great effect in Canada and Alaska on game like moose and brown/grizzly bear. It also really took off with American hunters going to Africa, especially post-World War II. The 375 H&H was actually among the original 9 chamberings offered for the Winchester Model 70 when Winchester introduced the rifle in 1936. They still make Model 70s in that chambering today. I think the 270, the 30-06, and the 375 H&H are the only 3 cartridges where that's the case, where they were initial offerings for the Model 70, and Winchester still makes Model 70s in those chamberings today. The 375 H&H was never super popular in terms of raw rifle sales because it is a more niche offering, and stuff like the 270 and the 30-06 and the like were always more popular. For reference, Model 70s and 375 made up about 2.5% of the pre-64 Model 70 rifles manufactured. For comparison, about 35% of those rifles were chambered in 30-06 and another 21% were chambered in 270 Winchester. Now, in addition to really taking off in the United States, the 375 H&H also benefited from legislation enacted in the 1950s standardizing .375 caliber as a minimum for use on thick-skinned dangerous game in many African countries as a response to people like Roy Weatherby using smaller cartridges on game like that with uneven results. As an aside, check out episode 333 of the podcast to learn more about what I turned up in my research regarding Roy Weatherby's use of a .257 Weatherby Magnum on a Cape buffalo in Africa and how that contradicts the popular narrative. Back to the 375 H&H. It is still incredibly popular today. It still fills the same role it was originally designed for over 100 years ago. That said, it is generally used more for buffalo and the like today than is the case for other game. It's still plenty popular for plains game, for bear, for moose, and the like, though. It also has served as the parent case for myriad cartridges like the British 300 H&H and the American 7mm Remington Magnum and 300 Winchester Magnum, among many other rounds. Okay, now let's talk about how the 9.3x62 compares to the 375 H&H. The 375 H&H Magnum is a larger caliber, flatter shooting, and more powerful cartridge. It's also loaded to a higher pressure as well. The 375 is loaded to a SAMI max average pressure of 62,000 psi, the 9.3, 57,500 psi. The 375 also has a physically larger case and can hold more powder. I measured the powder capacity of some fired Hornady brass for both cartridges, came up with an average of 76.1 grains of water for the 9.3 and 96.7 grains of water for the 375. That is about 27% more case capacity for the 375. So add it all up, the 375 is a physically much larger cartridge, can hold more powder, fires a larger caliber bullet, and is loaded to a higher pressure. So yes, it is more powerful than the 9.3. But on the flip side, the 9.3x62 has quite a bit less recoil. This cartridge also penetrates surprisingly well too. More on this in a second. Now, because the 375 H&H is a physically larger cartridge, it also requires physically larger and more expensive rifles. Overall length of the 375 H&H cartridge is 3.6 inches long. That requires a longer Magnum length action, while the shorter 9.3x62 will fit in a 30-06 length action. The 9.3 has a SAMI spec overall length of 3.291 inches, so it's actually a little bit shorter than a 30-06. There are, of course, exceptions, but that standard versus Magnum length action split has generally resulted in higher prices for 375 rifles than is the case with 9.3x62 rifles on average. The Ruger Safari Magnum and the Ruger Hawkeye are great examples of this, and the Ruger Safari Magnum is considerably more expensive than the Hawkeye, and we'll talk more about this in a second as well. Now, like I mentioned earlier, Germany had all of these colonies in Africa prior to World War I. Well, German Southwest Africa turned into what is now Namibia and was administered by South Africa for a long time. Tanganyika was taken over by the British, and the German colonies of Cameroon and Togoland were split between the British and the French. So, long story short, the British took over almost all of the German African colonies after World War I. And yes, even South Africa at the time was a self-governing dominion within the British Empire. Well, for that reason, combined with just the chaos going on in Germany after the war, supplies of 9.3x62 rifles and ammo really dried up, and the British stepped in and started to fill that void with their rifles and ammunition, especially the 375 H&H. Later on, a lot of those colonies adopted that 375 caliber minimum for hunting thick-skinned dangerous game, which the 9.3x62, which fires .366 caliber bullets, falls a little short of. And there are exceptions to this, and I'll talk about that shortly too. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, the 375 also became extremely popular in North America, the United States in particular, especially after World War II. The end result is the 375 H&H is much more widely used today. Though some would argue whether it's a big bore or a medium bore, if we defined a big bore cartridge as something that is both legal and widely accepted for use on thick-skinned dangerous game, the 375 H&H is far and away the most popular big bore cartridge in the world. And it is an excellent rifle cartridge. Here's what Finn Agard had to say about the cartridge in the book Any Shot You Want. The virtue of the 375 H&H is that it works well on even the largest beast without generating horrendous recoil. Most hunters can learn to tolerate it sufficiently to place their shots where they need to go. If he asked, I always advised a client to bring a scope-sighted 375 for dangerous game rather than an iron-sighted heavy. He would shoot better with it, and placement of the first shot, assuming adequate penetration and no bullet failure, is the key issue. If the client put the bullet in the right spot, there would be far less chance that I would have to take up my .458 to follow some sick and nasty animal into the thick stuff. That is still true. The 375 H&H remains, now more than ever, what Hollands meant it to be, the ultimate all-around big game cartridge. End of quote. That is a true statement. I agree wholeheartedly with what Finn had to say there. That said, there are a lot of the same advantages to both the 375 H&H and the 9.3, and there is a tremendous overlap in the best use cases for each one. And you could essentially say the same thing about the 9.3 that Finn said in that excerpt I just read to you, but it's just a little bit less powerful and has a little less recoil. So how much of a difference are we talking about here? Well, the 375 shoots .375 caliber bullets. The 9.3 shoots .366 caliber bullets. That is a difference of 9/1000ths of an inch. That is approximately the same difference between a .264 caliber and a .257 caliber bullet, and a .284 caliber and a .277 caliber bullet. Both of those have a difference of 7/1000ths. So right there with them. A typical load for the 9.3 shoots a 286 grain bullet at about 2,360 feet per second, which works out to just over 3,500 foot-pounds of energy, a momentum value of 96, a Taylor KO value of 35. The 375 H&H, typical load for it, 300 grain bullet at 2,550 feet per second. That generates about 4,300 foot-pounds of kinetic energy, 109 momentum, 40 KO value. So the 375 has about 22% more kinetic energy, about 13% more momentum, and about a 14% higher Taylor KO value than the 9.3. It is certainly more powerful. Is it more effective? Is it better? Yes and no. As a quick aside, I'm not saying the Taylor KO factor is the end-all, be-all, or anything like that here. I think it's just an interesting way to compare cartridges that also incorporates frontal diameter. We are in the midst of a trend overall towards smaller calibers, but there is certainly something to the effectiveness of a bigger bore round, especially on really big game. And furthermore, some places still have that .375 caliber minimum for hunting dangerous game. But like I mentioned earlier, there are exceptions. Zimbabwe is a great example of this. They have a 9.2 millimeter minimum. That's a remnant of Don Heath's affinity for the cartridge. So sometimes that 9/1000th larger diameter makes a big difference between being on the right side versus the wrong side of the law. So I have conversations with professional hunters all the time, and especially if we're talking about hunting buffalo or something, it'll often come up, hey, what cartridge do you recommend that I bring if I go on this hunt? And they'll usually say something like, I'd really like you to bring a 375 H&H at a minimum, and if you can shoot it well, yeah, bring something bigger. And then I'll ask, well, what about a 9.3x62? And they'll almost always say, oh yeah, that's fine too. So despite what the numbers might appear to say at first glance, the 9.3x62 certainly seems to quote-unquote punch above its weight. That has been my experience using it afield. That has also been my experience shooting into ballistic gel. In general, when we're using the same bullets for each one, I have observed the 375 H&H will make a larger wound than the 9.3x62, but the 9.3 will generally penetrate better. That is the case with every single load I have tested for both cartridges when using expanding bullets. Now, I do have to give my normal disclaimer before I start talking about this in more detail. Results in ballistic gel, especially clear gel like I use, don't normally translate exactly one-to-one into real-world situations on game. Bullets tend to penetrate better, but not make as large of a wound cavity in clear gel versus on a real-life animal. Animals also aren't completely homogeneous like gel is either. So the results that I'm about to tell you about should be taken as a general trend. I'm not saying that if a bullet penetrates X number of inches in gel, that it will penetrate exactly that far in real animals from every angle, regardless of what it hits all the time. I'm just saying that if a bullet demonstrates wide, shallow penetration in gel, it'll also probably produce wide, shallow penetration on animals. Likewise, if bullet A penetrates better than bullet B in gel, it will probably penetrate better than bullet B in an animal as well. Same thing with the wound cavity it makes, etc. So take all that for what you will. So here are two examples that demonstrate what I'm talking about. First, I tested the 375 and the 9.3x62 in gel using Hornady's SPRP or interlock loads from their Dangerous Game line. 270 grain bullet for the 375, 286 grain bullet for the 9.3. The 375 made a massive, very wide wound cavity in the gel. Penetration was not that impressive at all. The 9.3 also made a very large wound cavity in the gel, but not quite as big as the 375, and it penetrated much deeper. I also tested loads for each one with a Swift A-frame. For the 9.3, I used a 286 grain Swift A-frame in a hand load that I actually made a long time ago for use on a buffalo hunt. I actually killed a buffalo with this exact load out of this exact rifle. And then I used a Federal factory load for the 375 H&H with a 300 grain Swift A-frame. Once again, both cartridges produced wide wound cavities. The 375 was a little bit larger than the 9.3. Penetration was excellent for the 375, but the 9.3 penetrated even deeper. Now, I personally would not recommend hunting buffalo with either one of those Hornady loads for each cartridge, but I think they would both be great for antelope and deer. But both of those A-frame loads would be outstanding for use on buffalo. And like I said, I've done it myself. I know a lot of other people do too. So with soft point bullets like these, the 375 does have the edge in terms of the size of wound the bullet produces. However, the 9.3 has the edge in terms of penetration. With solids, the 375 H&H has the edge in both areas. Okay, so why is this the case? Well, the fact that the 375 makes a wider wound really shouldn't be surprising. It's a larger caliber bullet. It's also going faster. But you would expect that a projectile with more momentum like the 375 would also penetrate better when you're talking about using the same bullets for each cartridge. However, as far as I can tell, the reason this occurs is the higher impact velocity of the 375 results in relatively more expansion for that bullet. That in turn subjects the bullet to more drag as it travels through the gel or through the animal, and it just doesn't penetrate quite as deep. Indeed, the 286 and 300 grain A-frame loads had the same sectional density before I fired them, but afterwards, when I recovered them, the 375 H&H actually had a slightly lower sectional density than the recovered 9.3mm projectile. And of course, that is not the case when discussing and comparing non-expanding solid projectiles for each cartridge. Now, while this is all very interesting, let's not lose the forest through the trees here. The 9.3 did produce a perfectly adequate wound channel, and the 375 had more than enough penetration for both circumstances. So just like how the number 100 is only a little bit bigger than the number 99, I wouldn't say it is a significant difference either way. But it is true that in general, each cartridge has the edge in those areas I just described nonetheless. This also matches up well with my experiences using both in the real world. For instance, I mentioned earlier that I purchased a CZ550 and 9.3x62 as a young man. I bought that rifle right after I graduated college, and I did a lot of deer hunting with it at my first duty station in the Army. And I remember one day as I was returning from a morning hunt, I decided to do a real-world test of the penetration of this cartridge. I was hunting in Georgia, and there were a lot of pine trees in that area. Most of them were 6 to 8 inches in diameter, so I thought, okay, this would be cool. I wonder if I can shoot through one of these trees with this cartridge. So I lined up on a tree, shot it dead center, and then I saw all kinds of stuff explode out the back of the tree. And then I noticed another tree 30 yards behind it that I hit almost dead center as well, and the bullet went through that tree too. And that was just a plain old 285 grain PPU projectile, but it penetrated through both of those trees like nobody's business.
Hi, I'm Richard Karn, and you may have seen me on TV talking about the world's #1 expandable garden hose. Well, the brand new Pocket Hose Copperhead with Pocket Pivot is here, and it's a total game changer. Old-fashioned hoses get kinks and creases at the spigot, but the Copperhead's Pocket Pivot swivels 360 degrees for full water flow and freedom to water with ease all around your home. When you're all done, this rust-proof anti-burst hose shrinks back down to pocket size for effortless handling and tidy storage. Plus, your super light and ultra-durable Pocket Hose Copperhead is backed with a 10-year warranty. What could be better than that? I'll tell you what, an exciting radio-exclusive offer just for you. For a limited time, you can get a free Pocket Pivot and their 10-pattern sprayer with the purchase of any size Copperhead hose. Just text WATER to 64,000. That's WATER to 64,000 for your 2 free gifts with purchase. WATER to 64,000.
By texting 64,000, you agree to receive recurring automated marketing messages from Pocket Hose. Message and data rates may apply. No purchase required. Terms apply. Available at pockethose.com/terms.
In that same vein, there's a gentleman named Dane Horrigan from Australia that contributed a column to the 9.3x62mm journal. In this column, he talks about using various types of bullets in his 9.3x62 that he used to take several hundred animals in Australia. Mainly wild boar, but also some feral horses and feral cattle. Well, he describes at one point a penetration test with a 286 grain North Fork cup point solid. He crept up on a group of feral pigs that were actively feeding and did not know that he was there, found a hog in that group he wanted to shoot, lined up a tree between him and the hog, fired that bullet through the tree and hit the hog on the other side. He said that tree was about 150 millimeters or about 6 inches thick. He said that cup point solid blew straight through the tree, hit exactly where he was aiming with virtually no deflection on that pig, punched completely through it, dropped the hog in its tracks. Now, don't try this sort of feat at home, but that is another demonstration of how darn well the 9.3 can penetrate, especially with a bullet like that. Now, with all of this talk about the fantastic penetration of the 9.3x62, it is a reasonable question to ask, gosh, do I need to worry about over-penetration with this cartridge? Is it a concern where I could hit an animal and then hit an unseen animal behind it? That's an excellent question. Now, I've often quoted a blurb from Kevin Robertson's book, Africa's Most Dangerous, where he relates a conversation that he had when he purchased his 9.3x62 from an old-timer that used that rifle for crop protection work against buffalo. That gentleman he bought it from talked about using that cartridge specifically because bullets from it were unlikely to exit a buffalo and hit an unseen buffalo behind them. Furthermore, he also talks about how bullets from a .375 often will exit a broadside buffalo and potentially hit that other animal. So how do you square that circle? Well, long story short, this guy was using solids. And like I mentioned earlier, when you're talking about comparing the exact same bullet, a solid fired from a .375 H&H will penetrate deeper than a solid fired from a 9.3x62. Now, I mentioned earlier that I killed a buffalo with my 9.3x62 with 286 grain Swift A-frames. I was hunting in Zimbabwe in the low veld very early in the year, February. was very hot, thick, rainy while we were there. Some days temperatures were getting well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, because it was so hot, animals were not very active during the day. They were doing a lot of movement at night, a little bit early in the morning. Then they would quickly bed down and then get up and start feeding again right at last light. So this was challenging hunting. One morning, we got on the trail of what looked like about 4 bull buffalo together. We followed those buffalo, eventually caught up with them, but they had already bedded. And we realized this in the middle of a very thick patch of woods when I saw the tracker freeze and get pretty excited. PH realized what was going on, and we very slowly backed out of there. Turned out those buffalo had already bedded, and we were right in the midst of all of these bedded buffalo in that thicket. And we were so close to them that we could hear one of them breathing, but couldn't see him. But fortunately, the buffalo never realized we were there. We got out, made a plan. We figured that these buffalo would leave that patch, head over to this field where they had been eating for the past couple of nights, and we found a good ambush spot where I could get on top of a big termite mound, see over this tall grass in that area, hopefully get a shot at one of these buffalo when they stood up in the evening and started heading towards that field. And that's exactly what ended up happening. These buffalo stood up, started walking in front of us a little over 100 yards away, but it was getting dark fast. And we picked out a nice bull from this group. Turned out there was indeed 4 that we saw. I shot him broadside in the shoulder with that 286 grain A-frame. The other 3 buffalo immediately disappeared. He staggered, took a few steps with his rear end facing us, stopped. I reloaded, fired again, and I hit him right in the rear end where the spine meets the pelvis, and he instantly dropped. I topped off my magazine, and we started approaching that buffalo because, like I said, it was getting dark fast. I had barely enough shooting light to shoot him at that point, and we wanted to finish this while we still had any daylight left. So we approached it, and while we were walking up to it, we heard the death bellow, which is always a good sign. I shot it twice more on the ground. Now, that first shot was with the A-frame. The next 3 shots were all with Woodley Full Metal Jacket bullets, all 286 grain projectiles. I recovered every single bullet from that buffalo, the A-frame and all 3 Woodleys. Now, I killed an American bison with my 375 H&H a couple of years ago. My first shot with the 375 onto this buffalo, it was about 100 yards away, also pretty close to broadside. I hit it a little bit far back. It was angling away from me a little bit. I hit it. It went through the paunch, hit the liver, and hit the back of the offside lung, stopped on the offside hide. I fired again, hit farther forward this time, hit both lungs, bullet lodged in the offside shoulder in this case. The buffalo took another few steps, laid down. I shot it again in the neck. That bullet exited, and that was the end of that with that buffalo. All 3 of those shots were taken with 300 grain Barnes TSX bullets from the 375. The shot through the neck exited, but neither of the shots to the body did. And those 300 grain Barnes bullets performed beautifully, expanded great, looked just like you would expect them to out of a Barnes advertisement. And they produced a wound almost as wide as the bottom of a Coke can through the lungs of that bison. And as you would expect, he didn't go very far at all after those shots. Now, Barnes bullets do penetrate really well, but they also do expand to a pretty large diameter, and it's not unusual to recover them from an animal that size. And I imagine if I would have had similar shot placement on a Cape buffalo, they also would have not exited. But if I were using 300 grain North Fork cut point solids or 300 grain Barnes banded solids on that bison with those shots, real good chance that they would have exited. Now, I was not really happy with how those Woodley Full Metal Jackets performed on that hunt. They worked fine on the buffalo. I didn't have big complaints about them. I didn't love how they worked, but they weren't great either. I also shot an elephant with my 9.3 on that same hunt in Zimbabwe I just told you about with the buffalo. I used those Woodley full metal jackets for every single shot on that elephant. I was not happy with how it worked in that case, but that's a much more challenging situation. I took a frontal brain shot on that elephant, and he went down but got up and ran away, and then we had to follow him up. Found out later that bullet had visibly bent. We recovered it from his head, and I can line that bullet up next to all of the other Woodleys that I recovered on that hunt, and you can tell which one, just by looking at it, I got from that elephant. That is definitely not how you want a solid bullet to look when you recover it. So a soft point bullet from either cartridge is unlikely to exit a buffalo. Doesn't matter if it's a Barnes, an A-frame, a North Fork semi-Spitzer, anything like that. A high-quality solid, like that North Fork cup point solid I keep talking about, is much more likely to exit, especially from a close-to-broadside shot. And you will get substantially more penetration with a bullet like that than you will with a traditional soft point bullet or even those Woodley full metal jackets I'm talking about. And like I mentioned, in gel, those cut point solids are going between 50 and 60 inches versus, say, 35 to 40 inches for the really good high-quality soft points for both cartridge. That's 20 to 30% more penetration. That is a giant difference. But these are extreme edge cases for both cartridges. Things are different when you use other bullets. Now, that guy I just told you about in Australia that killed all of those animals with a 9.3x62, he has it broken down by all of these different bullets that he used, what he killed with them, and how they performed generally in the book. I'll read you a blurb from his section about the 232 grain Norma Oryx. I took 154 animals with the 232 grain Norma Oryx at varying ranges from roughly 40 to 120 meters. I found the Oryx to be a reliable projectile for medium-sized game like boars. Every boar that was shot through the shoulder, I recovered the projectile from the opposite side shoulder pad. The projectile exited boars taken with broadside behind the shoulder shots, and with quartering shots, the Oryx always penetrated into the chest cavity. The largest game I took with the Oryx was a Brumbley stallion. As an aside, that's what they call wild horses in that area. The shot took him through the shoulder at around 100 meters, dropping him on the spot. The autopsy revealed the projectile broke his shoulder, plowed through his chest cavity, taking out the top of his heart before coming to a rest under the opposite shoulder. End of quote. That sounds like fantastic terminal performance on medium game like that. I would not recommend using that Oryx bullet, especially the 232 grain version of it, on a buffalo. But if you're shooting deer, hogs, things of that nature, even bigger stuff like, that horse that he shot with it works fine. But a bullet that is not exiting even a wild boar under certain circumstances certainly is not a buffalo bullet, at least in my opinion. Now, I have a lot of experience using a 258 grain H-Mantle bullet out of my 9.3. That is a German bullet manufactured by RWS. It's pretty old. I think they released it in the 1930s. But long story short, this bullet has a dual core construction with a crimp in the jacket that makes the rear core hold together. So the idea with this bullet is that front core is made of a soft lead, has a thinned jacket, and when it hits an animal, that portion of the bullet will go to pieces, cause a massive wound cavity, fragments going everywhere. But that rear core is much harder lead, has a much thicker jacket, and it has the jacket, like I said, kind of crimped around it in a little bit of an H, like they call it with the H-Mantle, so that the rear core holds together and it looks like a tiny little wad cutter bullet that penetrates through. So the front core blows up, makes a mess inside of it. The rear core continues to penetrate and will often exit the opposite side of the animal. And since it doesn't exit with a giant mushroom, instead just that wad cutter type shape with a flat nose, it makes a real clean exit wound that bleeds well, but also doesn't blow a giant hole on the offside of the animal too. So the idea with this bullet is that you try and get the best of both worlds, where you get a massive wound cavity with deep penetration and an exit wound that will bleed, but not an exit wound that is so large that it will ruin your taxidermy. I've used that bullet on deer, feral hogs, a black bear, impala, and zebra. Results have been basically picture perfect every time I've used it. For instance, I shot a hog with it at one point, hit it straight through both shoulders, straight through the vitals. The hog let out a squeal and took off running like they sometimes do, ran 50 yards, tipped over. That was the easiest blood trail I've ever followed in my life. It looked like someone was just running through the woods, spraying blood everywhere. I shot a zebra with it in Zimbabwe. Once again, straight through the shoulder. That zebra dropped like it had been struck by lightning. Nice caliber-sized entrance wound. Massive internal damage. It looked like a hand grenade went off inside the chest cavity of that zebra, and then a nice caliber-sized exit wound out the offside shoulder. Plenty of penetration for medium game. I would not hunt buffalo with it, but I think that's a great bullet for basically everything up to buffalo. Elk, moose, red deer, all of that stuff. I think it's great. Downside of that bullet is it is very expensive, and it is almost impossible to find in the United States. It's more popular in Europe. I think my dad found a bunch of them on Gunbroker or something. He has all kinds of odd stuff in his garage, but this is one of those things that works really darn well. So I say all of these stories to tell you that, yes, the 9.3 will penetrate really well, but it all depends on the bullet that you are using. It needs to be a bullet of sufficient weight and appropriate construction. Now, one of the reasons the 9.3x62 penetrates so well is that it tends to use bullets with a relatively high sectional density, and it fires those bullets at a moderate velocity. So here's how the 9.3 and the 375 stack up next to each other in terms of sectional density. 250 grain bullets for both. 0.254 sectional density for the 375, 0.267 for the 9.3. 300 grain bullet for the 375 has a 0.305 sectional density. That is the same as a 286 grain bullet for the 9.3. A 350 grain bullet for the 375 has a sectional density of 0.356. The heaviest bullet I have ever seen offered in a factory load for the 9.3x62 is a 325 grain Norma Oryx. That bullet has a sectional density of 0.347. So the 375 has a higher upper end threshold for this stuff than the 9.3, but there's a lot of overlap in the middle with a lot of the most common bullet weights these cartridges are offered in. And depending on the details, they either have the same or very similar sectional densities at the lower end, or the 9.3 will have a small advantage. And when you are calculating sectional density for bullets of the same weight for these two different cartridges, since the 9.3 uses a smaller diameter bullet, those bullets will have a slightly higher sectional density. And you have to have a heavier bullet for the 375 to have the same sectional density, like with the 286 versus 300 grain bullets for each one. This leads me to my next point. Recoil. This is another area where the 9.3 has an edge. I calculated the free recoil energy generated by both of these cartridges, typical factory loads for each one, out of 8-pound rifles, respectively. And also, just for comparison's sake, I calculated recoil for a typical load for a 30-06 as well. 180 grain bullet at 2,700 feet per second. 30-06 produces about 23 foot-pounds of free recoil energy. 286 grain bullet at 2,300 feet per second generates 36 foot-pounds of recoil energy. So that's about 45% more than the 30-06. 375, 300 grain bullet at 2,500 feet per second generates about 51 foot-pounds of free recoil energy. That's about 41% more than the 9.3 and over twice as much as the 30-06. Now, that's all out of 8-pound rifles. My Ruger Hawkeye in 9.3x62 weighs 8.6 pounds as I hunt with it. That's with a scope, sling, full magazine. My Ruger M77 Mark II and 375 H&H weighs 11.4 pounds set up identically. So I calculated the free recoil energy for those exact loads I just described, but out of those exact rifles. The 375 has 35.8 foot-pounds of free recoil energy. The 9.3x62 has 33.5. So even in a situation where I'm firing the 375 H&H from a rifle nearly 3 pounds heavier, that is a gigantic difference. The 375 still has about 7% more free recoil energy than the 9.3. And that rifle for the 9.3 is on the light side as well. If you increase the rifle weight for the 9.3 to 10 pounds, free recoil energy drops down to about 29 foot-pounds of free recoil energy. That's only a little bit more than the 30-06. Do not discount how much of an advantage this is. The 375 H&H is certainly more powerful. But is it better? Well, if your initial shot placement is a little off, then no. And it is easier to shoot better with less recoil. And the 9.3 has an undeniable edge here. Now, moving on, the 375 H&H is a much higher velocity cartridge than the 9.3x62. Traditional big bore rifles generally don't have very fast muzzle velocities, right? The 450-400 shoots a 400-grain bullet at about 2150 feet per second. 458 Win Mag shoots a 500-grain bullet at about that same velocity. Same with the 470 Nitro. 500 Nitro shoots a 570-grain bullet at about 2150. The 416 Rigby, 458 Lot, and 9.3 are all going a little faster, all around 2,400 feet per second. The 375 H&H is doing 2,500 to 2,550 with a 300-grain bullet. That goes up to about 2,700 feet per second with a 270-grain bullet. Now, that higher velocity is a double-edged sword. On the plus side, it does result in a flatter trajectory and better performance at extended range. But how often is that important, especially in Africa? 400 yards is a long shot over there. Maybe on something like Mountain in Yala, you'd be more likely to take a shot at a range like that. But almost everything you shoot over there is going to be within 200 yards for plains game and probably within 100 yards for buffalo. Now, the downside of that higher velocity is it comes with increased chances of bullet failure, especially with older bullet designs at close range. Here's another excerpt from the 375 section of Any Shot You Want, written by Finn Agard. I have experienced bullet failures, though. The old Winchester soft with that little flat nose would often rivet or break up. Thrice I have had 300-grain soft-nose bullets shatter in buffalo shoulder joints and fail to penetrate further. End of quote. Now, he does go on to say that he has experienced much better results with modern controlled expansion bullets. That has been my experience with the cartridge, too. So I'm not saying not to hunt with a 375 because it's going to blow up on the shoulder or any of that stuff. As long as you're using an appropriate bullet, you should be in good shape. Now, I'm also not saying that bullet failures never happen with the 9.3. They do seem to be more common with the 375. And like I mentioned earlier, I think the more sedate velocity of the 9.3 also enhances penetration. Similar deal with, say, the 7x57 Mauser. Now, I often hear people say in critiques about both the 9.3 and the 375 that they're not, quote-unquote, stopping cartridges. That is true for both of them. But let's also get real here. You need to hit an animal in the right spot to stop a charge, regardless of what you are using. Bigger calibers do provide some leeway here, and they do deliver more effect on game. But it's also not like you can just shoot a charging buffalo anywhere with a 5.77 Nitro and be guaranteed to instantly stop that charge either. In a situation like that, between the 9.3 and the 375, the 9.3x62 might have a small edge here with the fact that it just facilitates better shot placement. And possibly you might be able to get back on target faster for a second shot, depending on how good you are with your rifle and what the exact circumstances of the charge are. I'm not sure how much of a difference that makes in the real world when the chips are down. I'd maybe give the 375 a small edge over the 9.3 here, but really there's probably not much practical difference between the two for stopping something like a charging buffalo. You really need to be using the right bullet in that situation, and it needs to be used in the hands of someone with a cool head that knows what they're doing and can place those shots exactly where they need to go. Now, here's another story that illustrates this point from the 9.3x62 journal. This is from a segment written by a gentleman named Dr. Lucas Potgeiser. He was relating a story hunting Cape buffalo with his uncle many years ago. The author was using a 404 Jeffrey. His uncle was using a Mauser in 9.3x62. The 404 roared the moment the front sight reached the spot just below the bull's nose, and I noticed how the bull staggered a little when the 400-grain full metal jacket hit home. Then it charged past us to the right. My next shot at the colossal beast had no effect. When I fired the last shot at the bull, it was quartering away. The shots had no effect on the bull as it charged away unhindered. Then I turned around to see my uncle bombarding at will with his 9.3x62. The herd was now at my rear and charging past me, while Uncle Jan was casually shooting at them from 25 meters. I witnessed as he pulled off his fourth shot. Next moment, a bull's legs folded underneath it and it slid through the bush. Then everything was over. "Where is your buffalo?" Uncle Jan asked. "He ran into the bush," I replied, rather embarrassed. "Did you get one too?" I asked. "There are 4, he replied. I realized right then the hunting field is the best place for a man to fit into his shoes again. We looked the 4 dead buffalo over. All were well-placed shots, and the 9.3x62 did its job. All of them had run a fair distance. 115 meters was the furthest, but the fact was that the 9.3x62 rifle I had thought was too light for the job performed better in the hands of my uncle than my 404 Jeffrey did in my hands. When we got to the dead tree trunk where my bull had disappeared into the bush, I made a silent prayer. Please let us find him where he died. There was lots of blood, and the froth in it indicated I had hit the lungs. Then we heard it, that long, drawn-out groan of an old bull giving his last farewell. That year, I started saving for my first 9.3x62. Now, that story did not involve any charging animals, but it showed what one well-placed shot from a 9.3x62 will do to a buffalo versus a couple of shots from a 404 that weren't as well-placed. Now, there were some people named Osa and Martin Johnson. They were American explorers and filmmakers that did a lot of work in Africa in the 1920s and 1930s. Martin did a lot of the filming. Osa did a lot of the support work, and to include protecting him from wild animals. And there is a video you can find on YouTube of Osa Johnson killing a charging rhino with a 9.3x62. And by the way, that story I told you at the beginning of this episode with Don Heath killing the charging elephant that fell down and broke his arm, well, he was using a 9.3x62, firing a 275-grain Norma solid. And lest you think I am giving too much attention to the 9.3 at the expense of the 375 here, John Taylor relates a story about killing a charging buffalo with a 375 H&H in his famous book, African Rifles and Cartridges. To set the scene, he was following a wounded buffalo somebody else had shot. As they often do, this buffalo went into a nasty thicket. John followed it up with his 375. He eventually caught up to the buffalo, and I quote, "He was standing behind a dense clump of undergrowth with a little clear patch in the center of it, and there was a clear space about 11 paces wide between me and the clump. He must have seen some movement, for he was looking straight at me. I let drive immediately, but my bullet had to find its way through a tangle of twigs and must have been deflected slightly. These 300-grain bullets are excellent for this sort of thing, but there are limits to what you can reasonably expect. The bull dropped to the shot, but in an instant was up again and coming. I sank to one knee and waited for him to break through the bush. When he did, I gave him the left barrel fairly in the center of his great chest. Well, the effect of that shot was exactly as though there had been a steel hawser stretched across his path, just at the right height above the ground to whip the 2 forelegs from under him. He crashed on his nose and his knees and remained like that with his hindquarters in the air whilst I reloaded. I was about to give him a bullet in the spine when he keeled over, stone dead." End of quote. Now, that is an unusual story, and you don't often hear stories about people stopping charging buffalo with a shot from the 375 to the chest like that. Assuming he was telling the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, this shows that that can happen sometimes. Perhaps it's less common with a 375 than with a 458 or a 500, but it can happen. I just share all of these stories to say that if you place your shot well, they both work great, even on charging animals. Both cartridges also fit the bill well for all-around use. I would say the 9.3x62 is less overkill on medium game. It also works perfectly fine on bigger animals. Now, like I mentioned earlier, I did a lot of deer hunting with a CZ550 and 9.3 back when I was a young lieutenant in the Army, and I primarily used 285 grain PPU soft points. That combination actually delivered one of the most impressive kills I have ever seen on a deer. I had a doe walk out in front of me, maybe 30 or 40 yards away, right before dark. She was close to broadside. I shot her right in the shoulder, and it looked like she had been hit by a truck. She staggered and collapsed, got up, and kind of halfway ran away from me and ran smack into a pine tree sapling that was maybe a couple of inches in diameter, but really tall. It was like a 12-foot tall tree, real tall, skinny tree. She ran straight over that tree and bent the whole tree down over her and took another few steps and then collapsed in a giant briar patch on the other side of that tree. She went maybe 10 yards after the shot. That PPU soft point literally blew part of her lung out of an exit wound a little bit bigger than a silver dollar. And she rubbed blood the entire length of this tree when she ran over it, then left a giant blood trail for a few feet until she finally collapsed in that briar patch. I've never seen anything like that before or since with any other cartridge. So that PPU soft point, I think, is a great load for hunting medium game like that. I wouldn't hunt buffalo with it. I'm sure some people probably have, but I think it is perfect for that sort of work. And the nice thing about that ammo is it is very inexpensive. Now, that hunt took place when I was a very young lieutenant. Shortly after that, I deployed to Iraq. I don't know what you were doing in 2010, but I spent almost that entire year in Iraq. I came back and I sold that CZ550 and bought a left-handed Ruger Hawkeye. That rifle started out as a 30-06. I got it rebarreled to 9.3x62. My dad did the exact same operation on his rifle, so he and I have identical left-handed Ruger Hawkeyes in 9.3x62. Mine has a 22-inch long barrel. His is 21 inches long, but that's the only difference between them otherwise. Now, he and I are both left-handed. We got these rifles specifically for a Cape Buffalo hunt in Zimbabwe we were planning in 2012. Now, we both considered buying rifles in 375 Ruger. That was a brand new cartridge at the time. Remember, this is 2010, 2011. We hesitated about doing that, though, because we were not sure about the longevity of the cartridge. And he and I did not want to be in a situation that other people have gotten stuck with other rounds, where you go buy a rifle in this brand new cartridge and then companies stop making ammo for it after a couple of years. Now, that did not turn out to be the case with the 375 Ruger. It's still around, still doing great, but that's why we got the much more established 9.3x62. So I have no issues whatsoever using that cartridge on medium game. Like I talked about, deer, hogs, black bear, zebra, all of that stuff. I think it is a perfect deer and antelope cartridge. It will also work for bigger animals. Worked great on his and my buffalo. It worked on the elephant, but I think it was barely adequate. I think it would have performed much better had I been using better quality solids. My options were pretty limited at the time, and fortunately the situation is much better now than was the case back then. I purchased my 375 H&H rifle much more recently. Back when I lived in El Paso, one of my neighbors passed away. The family had an estate sale. I just took a walk one afternoon to see what was going on out there, looked around the house, saw a Ruger Safari Magnum in pristine condition for sale at a price I could not pass up, and I purchased it then. Now, before I actually bought that rifle, I actually had done some hunting with the 375 H&H. I took a trip to South Africa in 2014 and did not bring one of my own rifles. And so I just used several different camp rifles on that hunt. And among other rifles I used on that safari, I used a CZ550 in 375 H&H. The first animal I ever took with that cartridge was an Impala at about 200 yards with a 300 grain Peregrine soft point bullet. That's a South African bullet. My shot placement was not great on it. I was shooting standing off of sticks, just a little bit longer of a shot than I had really practiced for at that point. I hit it just a little bit far back, and I clipped the back of both lungs, hit the liver. But that bullet made a massive wound in the animal, and the Impala went less than 50 yards after the shot. And if you have ever watched any of my videos on YouTube, that's the Impala you can see on the wall behind me. It's a European mount. Now, a shot on that exact same Impala at that angle with that exact same shot placement with something like a 30-06 also still would have killed it, but it wouldn't have made quite as big of a wound. I'm sure we still would have found that Impala, but it probably would have gone a little bit farther. So that is one of the benefits of a cartridge like the 9.3 or the 375 H&H on medium game like that. And while I think the 9.3x62 is wonderful for medium game, and it also works just fine on bigger game like buffalo, I think the 375 H&H is a little bit better choice for use on bigger stuff like that, provided the hunter can shoot it as accurately as they can in 9.3x62. You place your shots where they need to go with a 375 with a great bullet on a buffalo. It is deadly, deadly, deadly. That 375 CZ550 I just told you about, we still use as a camp rifle in Africa. And if a guy ever comes over, wants to hunt Cape buffalo and doesn't bring his own rifle, that's what he used. And there is no telling how many buffalo have been killed with that rifle. It is dozens, possibly upwards of 100. And as good as the 375 H&H is on buffalo with something like a 300 grain A-frame or Barnes, using heavier 350 and 380 grain bullets like a 350 North Fork Semi-Spitzer or a 380 Rhino turns it into almost a completely different cartridge. Since they are so heavy and so well constructed, those bullets still penetrate really well, but they expand to a larger diameter and inflict an even bigger wound than, say, a 300 grain controlled expansion bullet out of the 375. Now, at least with the typical hunter these days, it seems like the 375 H&H is primarily used for dangerous game today, and also on a mixed bag safari. Every now and then we have a guy comes over just for antelope and will bring a 375 to hunt everything with. But it's more common in a situation like that for someone to use a 7mm or a 30 caliber if they are only hunting plains game. Even if a guy is hunting buffalo and plains game, it seems like it's most common for that hunter to bring a 375 for the buffalo and then bring a smaller cartridge for the rest. It does happen, though. I actually have a guy in South Africa as I record this for buffalo and plains game using his 375 H&H for everything. This guy bought his 375 H&H specifically for that hunt, and that is pretty common. I've often found that when people want to go to Africa specifically for buffalo and they want to use their own rifle, they'll buy a 375 H&H or a 375 Ruger specifically for that task because it is enough for the job. Recoil is manageable. Rifles and ammo for 375 are easier to find and less expensive than all of the other bigger stuff, 416, 458, 470, etc. Now, you can use the 375 on elephant, and people do, but it seems like elephant hunters will usually get something bigger for a hunt like that. The same is also true if they do a lot of buffalo hunting. So it seems like the 375 is primarily used on buffalo and hippo, etc., with a little bit of extension up to use on elephant and more extension down to use on antelope, deer, and the like. The 9.3 seems to be most popular among those who want a heavy-hitting, all-around rifle. Really popular in Europe where a person can hunt a wide spectrum of game. Roe deer, wild boar, red deer, maybe even bear, etc. Same thing in Australia, where I've heard they're very popular for stuff like sambar deer. Same with stuff up in northern Australia. Boar, water buffalo, feral cattle, feral horses, all that stuff. but I don't often see people buying a 9.3x62 specifically to hunt buffalo with. Yes, it happens, right? I'm one of those people, so is my dad, but it seems like the people who use it on Cape buffalo, and there aren't nearly as many of those people as there are people who use a 375 on buffalo, will use the 9.3 on that hunt specifically because they already own one and they like it, instead of going out to buy a 9.3 specifically to hunt buffalo with. I could be wrong about that. That's just the impression I get. Now let's talk about rifle and ammo availability for both. We'll start with rifles. At this instant, Ruger currently offers their number one single shot in 9.3x62 as a 20-inch long barrel, full-length Mannlicher style stock. Looks like a beautiful rifle. Sauer makes rifles in 9.3. Same thing with Tikka. You can also get more expensive rifles from Rigby and Mauser with their Model 98 and Model 12. I think Blaser makes rifles in 9.3x62 as well. And if they don't right now, they certainly have in the past. As far as older rifles that were chambered in 9.3, you got the CZ550. There were some Ruger Hawkeyes made in 9.3x62. I don't think any were made in left hand like mine, but I know they made it for at least 1 year in their standard Ruger Hawkeye rifle. Companies like Husqvarna made them as well, and you can find older Mausers out there too. It's really too bad that CZ discontinued the 550. That was available in 9.3 and in 375 and in 458 and 416 and all sorts of great Safari cartridges. I really like the 550 American I had previously, and I would have held on to it if I were right-handed or if I could have gotten that rifle in a left-handed version. As far as the 375 H&H goes, Winchester makes the Model 70 in 375 H&H. That's actually probably my number one recommendation for someone that wants to go buffalo hunting with a 375 H&H with a new production rifle. The Model 70 Safari Express and Alaskan variants of the rifle are both chambered in 375 H&H. Both are great rifles, very similar overall. The Safari Express version has a 24-inch long barrel. The Alaskan has a 25-inch barrel. Two rifles also have a little bit different finish on them, but they are very, very similar. Both are excellent rifles. Formerly Dakota, now Park West Arms, also makes excellent 375 H&H rifles. They are pricey, but you get what you pay for with them, though. Bergara makes their Premier Canyon in it. Christensen Arms makes a Ridgeline in 375. You can get the Rigby Big Game rifle in it as well. Same thing with the Mauser 98. Blaser also makes their R8 in 375 too. As far as older rifles go, like I mentioned, the CZ550 was available in it, but it's been discontinued. Ruger made their number one in 375 H&H for a while. They also made their Safari Magnum in the cartridge. Remington made their 700 rifle in it. You can also find some old Browning rifles in 375. Same thing with old Kimbers. Specifically, they made the Caprivi and Talcatina rifles in 375. And while Kimber still lists them on their website, I think those rifles have been discontinued. But someone feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, though. The now discontinued Blaser R93 was available in it, and also a similar deal with the Husqvarna rifles I just mentioned. In this same vein, there are some magazine size differences between these two cartridges, but it varies depending on the rifle. For instance, the Model 70 in 375 has a 3-round capacity. You get a 4-round capacity in 375 for the Ruger M77 Mk II, 5-round capacity for the CZ550, 5 for the Mauser 98. For the 9.3, the Tikka holds 3 rounds. The Ruger M77 Hawkeye I have holds 4. Same thing with the Rigby Highland Stalker. Mauser rifles have 5 down. Same thing with the 550. You can get a magazine extension from Alaska Arms for the Ruger M77 Hawkeye. That bumps your magazine capacity up to 6 rounds in the magazine, plus 1 in standard calibers like 9.3, 35 Whelen, 30-06. You only get 1 round of extra capacity if you use that magazine extension on, say, a 375 Ruger. I don't have one of these extensions on my 9.3x62. But JVB told me that he has done that with his Hawkeye in 35 Whelen, and I think I just need to go buy one of those myself, put it on my Hawkeye in 9.3, That will give me 7 rounds on tap. Now, I can hear somebody saying right now, John, if you can't get it done with 4 shots, then you have no business hunting. You should take up another hobby. To a certain extent, that is true. But there are times when those extra rounds can come in handy, even for a person that shoots well, especially on a dangerous game hunt. I will share a story with you that illustrates this. This also illustrates one of the downsides of the Ruger Hawkeye, especially in .375 Ruger with regards to magazine size. We had a guy that was hunting Cape buffalo in Africa with us several years ago with that Ruger guide gun in .375 Ruger. He was hunting very late in the day, right before dark, got a shot on a nice buffalo that was in an open patch, but standing literally right next to some thick brush. So we were running out of light, and there was a concern that this buffalo would get into the brush where things could get western, so to speak. Our hunter made a great initial shot on this buffalo. He was close to broadside, went straight through the shoulder. The buffalo swapped ends. He shot him again in the other shoulder. Johan, the PH, was with him. He fired with his .416 Rigby, hit the buffalo in the hips specifically to break him down. Because like I said, they did not want him to get into that thick cover as it was getting dark. The hunter fired again, also hit the buffalo in the chest. The buffalo went down. They thought it was over, but he started trying to get back up. The hunter reloaded, fired again. The buffalo went down. He continued trying to get back up, almost regained his feet. The hunter fired again, hit him in the chest. He went down again, shot him in the neck, and he still kept struggling and trying to get up. Between Johan and the hunter, they ended up shooting that buffalo 13 times. He was using a .375 Ruger, 300-grain Barnes bullets. Every shot was straight through the vitals, except that one shot where Johan hit him in the hips with his .416 Rigby to break him down. So yes, it is easy for people to dismiss concerns about magazine size because, after all, they shoot well, and they always have things go perfectly according to plan on all of their hunts. But in the real world, there is a very real benefit to having a couple of other rounds on tap just in case. You probably won't need them, but if you do, then you really will need them. Kevin Robertson describes an incident in episode 124 of the podcast where that one extra round in the magazine was the difference between life and death with a charging Cape buffalo. Now, with regards to magazine size, the details depend on the exact rifle, of course, right? The single-shot Ruger No. 1 just holds one cartridge regardless of the chambering, and a CZ in .375 will have a larger capacity than a standard Ruger Hawkeye or a Tikka in 9.3, for instance. But I wouldn't hunt buffalo with that Tikka rifle. I think the Tikka is a great all-around hunting rifle for Europe and even Africa for everything but dangerous game, but it doesn't have a controlled feed action. Likewise, I would not use that Christensen Arms Ridgeline or the Bergara Canyon for buffalo too. They're all fine for non-dangerous game, but not buffalo. So really, that Model 70 is the number one rifle in current production I would recommend that you hunt buffalo with. I'm not trying to pick on the Model 70 with its magazine capacity here, right? That's an excellent rifle overall, but that's also the only .375 H&H control feed rifle in current production, and the magazine capacity is a shortcoming with it. And depending on the exact rifle you're talking about, 9.3x62, you could potentially get 1 to 3 additional rounds of magazine capacity. So the details matter a lot. Now let's talk about ammo selection. You do have more choices for the .375. For instance, Midway has 34 ammo options listed on their website for .375 H&H, just 13 for 9.3x62. Just to rattle off a few here, you can get loads from Barnes with the TSX and Bandit Solid. You can get a Federal Power Shock loading. Get a couple loadings from Hornady. You got that interlock load I talked about earlier. They have loads with the DGX Bonded and DGS. You get the Hornady Outfitter load with the 250-grain CX. Federal offers loads with 300-grain Trophy Bonded Bear Claw and Sledgehammer Solid and a 300-grain A-frame. They used to offer a load with the 300-grain Woodley Hydro Solid, but they have it listed as discontinued right now. Nosler makes factory loads with 260-grain and 300-grain AccuBond bullets. They also make loads with 300-grain partition bullets and Nosler Safari solids. PPU makes a loading with a soft point. Remington makes a 270-grain soft point load. You can also get one of a couple different loads from Buffalo Bore. Now for the 9.3x62, Hornady makes that load with a 286 grain interlock. Swift offers factory loads for it with their Swift Solid and the Swift A-frame. You can get that load from Federal, I mentioned earlier, with the A-frame and the Woodley Hydro Solid. Nosler makes ammo for the 9.3x62 with their E-tip and Accubon bullet. Norma makes several different factory loads with different bullets as well. There's that PPU soft point load. S&B makes ammo. So does Buffalo Bore. Now, that PPU load I keep talking about is the quote-unquote cheap ammo for both cartridges. Significantly less expensive than everything else for either one. Talking $30, $35 a box. Other 9.3 ammo is considerably more expensive than that. Other 375 ammo is quite a bit more expensive than even 9.3 ammo. Now, Barnes does not offer loaded 9.3x62 ammo, but you can get 9.3mm 250 and 286 grain TSX bullets, 286 grain banded solid, 250 grain TTSX bullets, all great choices that a hand loader can use. Situation is similar for hand loading the 375 with Barnes bullets. They do make a LRX bullet in 375 caliber, also the banded solid TSX and TTSX. Swift makes component A-frame bullets for both 250, 270, 300 grain for the 375, 250, 286, 300 grain for the 9.3. 286 grain and 300 grain Swift breakaway solids, respectively, are also available for the 9.3 and the 375. Now, I am not sure what is going on with Swift. I have heard a lot of rumors, but availability of their stuff has been terrible for the past few years. I found some Federal 9.3 and 375 H&H ammo with the A-frame bullet that was in stock, but Swift component bullets in general are as rare as hen's teeth these days. I found 3.66 caliber 286 grain A-frames, but aside from 270 and 7mm A-frame component bullets, that is it for the A-frame in any caliber right now. It seems like they really started having problems during COVID, and while other companies have bounced back from that, Swift really seems to be lagging behind. Now, North Fork also makes component bullets in both cartridges or both calibers as well. In 3.66 caliber, they make 214, 250, 286 grain semi-Spitzer bullets. Those are their bonded soft point bullets, great for use on Buffalo. They also make a 286 grain flat point solid and cup point solid for the 9.3. 375, they make 250, 270, 300, and 350 grain semi-Spitzer bonded soft point bullets. 300 and 350 grain cup point and flat point solids. They also make 300 and 350 grain percussion point bullets. Now, the percussion point is not available in 9.3mm. North Fork is somewhat unique with those heavier weight 375 caliber bullets. And like I mentioned earlier, a 350 grain semi-Spitzer on a Buffalo is deadly, deadly, deadly. Now, the percussion point bullet is a somewhat unique design. It is still bonded, but it is designed for more rapid expansion, specifically for cats, leopard, and lion in particular. I would not use it on Buffalo. It still penetrates really well and everything, but not as good as the regular semi-Spitzer bullet. But it's a wonderful bullet for use on cats, also great for use on plains game. North Fork's cup point solid is a great, deep, penetrating solid projectile that also makes a very wide wound for a solid bullet like that. Now, in contrast to a traditional solid, which make wound channels around caliber size, sometimes a little smaller or larger depending on the bullet shape, the 3.66 and 3.75 caliber cup point solid make a much wider wound that is comparable to, like I mentioned earlier, what you would see sometimes from, say, a 7mm or 30 caliber soft point bullet. But penetration is ridiculous. In gel, for instance, 270 grain interlock for the 375 penetrated just shy of 23 inches for me. That's typical for a soft, unbonded bullet like that. 300 grain A-frame went 36 inches. That is excellent. Some of the best penetration I have observed in gel. Well, the 300 grain cup point solid went a whopping 59 inches. Now remember, gel doesn't translate one-to-one on game in real life, but it's useful for comparing how two different bullets perform. and that cup point solid penetrates like nobody's business. And like I said, North Fork makes it for both the 9.3 and the 375, and other typical Safari cartridges too, 416, 458, etc. Now let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the two rifles I own in these chamberings. A Ruger Safari Magnum, also known as the M77 Mk II in 375 H&H, and a Ruger Hawkeye in 9.3x62. The M77 Mk II is the older rifle. It is much heavier, much nicer, much more expensive. Even though it is the higher priced offering, I have heard from multiple sources, to include Jon Snow, episode 366, that Ruger lost money on every single one of those rifles they produced. So that must have been a fantastically expensive rifle to manufacture. But the quality shows. Great quality wood, beautiful bluing on the metal, utilizes a Mauser-style controlled feed action, 3-position safety, just a great overall feel to the rifle. While they made the M77 Mk II in a number of different chamberings, the Safari Magnum version of this rifle was only in Magnum-length big bore cartridges, 375 H&H, 416 Rigby, and 458 Lot, 23, 24-inch long barrel, mine is 24 inches. This is a great example of American manufacturing on display. Well, because it was so expensive to produce, they eventually replaced the M77 Mk II with the Ruger Hawkeye. If I recall correctly, they started producing the Hawkeye in 2006, then completely discontinued the M77 Mk II around 2010. The M77 Hawkeye is similar in many respects besides the name, but it is not nearly as nice of a rifle. Action is very similar, still controlled round feed, still has a 3-position safety, etc. Everything about it is taken down a notch or two in quality, the wood, the metal, etc. Now, another important difference is the overall size of the rifle. It's only available in standard or short action chamberings, that is to say 6.5 Creedmoor, 308, up to 30-06 length. They make a bunch of different variations of the Hawkeye currently, but most pertinent to this discussion are the Ruger Guide Gun and the Ruger Hawkeye African. Both rifles use the Hawkeye action, and there's just some changes all around the edges, barrel length, stock configuration, what the stock is made out of, all those sort of things. Ruger is known for really switching up the chamberings offered in their rifles, so it does change from year to year and within the different parts of the line. But for instance, right now they offer their guide gun in 30-06, 375 Ruger, 338 Win Mag, and 416 Ruger. They also offer a left-handed version in 375 Ruger. Those rifles have a 20-inch long barrel regardless of chambering. They offered their Hawkeye African in 375 Ruger, 35 Whelen, 450 Bushmaster, 270 and 416 Ruger. Barrel lengths vary. 450 Bushmaster, 18.5 inches. The others are 23 or 24 inches long, depending on the chambering. Now, they no longer do, but at one point, Ruger did make some Hawkeye rifles in 9.3x62, but that's one of those cartridges they ran for a year and then discontinued it. And like I said, mine started as a 30-06, and I had it rebarreled to 9.3. Now, they also rolled out their 375 and 416 Ruger cartridges in this rifle. Those cartridges are designed to mimic the performance of the old 375 H&H and 416 Rigby, but do so out of a much smaller standard length action. And they do so by utilizing a short, fat case on those cartridges. Now, the Hawkeye is also considerably lighter than the Safari Magnum. Everybody that handles my Ruger Safari Magnum comments on how heavy it is. Ruger produces several different variations of their Hawkeye rifle. But of particular note to our discussion here, they make their Hawkeye African and their guide gun in a lot of the same chamberings. Now, the Hawkeye African in 35 Whelen is listed at 7.5 pounds. Their current production guide gun in 375 Ruger is 8.1 pounds. Those are both slick, no scope, anything like that. Now, my Hawkeye in 9.3, 8.6 pounds as I actually hunt with it. Now, that lighter weight, kind of like the velocity of the 375 H&H, is also a double-edged sword. Lighter rifles are easier to carry, but that also increases felt recoil. Now, one of Kevin Robertson's complaints about the Hawkeye rifle in episode 106 was that the light weight of the rifle made for unacceptably heavy recoil. He said the one he initially tested around 2007 was 7.5 pounds. He said it was not fun to shoot, and he said that recoil was so stout it pushed the bullets into the case on the cartridges in his magazine after they went through recoil for several shots. He said the stock also cracked after 20 rounds, and I can't understand why he was disappointed. Kevin said he chronographed ammo and said that a 300-grain bullet was going nearly 2,700 feet per second back then out of that rifle with a 20-inch long barrel. That was with Hornady factory ammo, and sounds like they've dialed things back a little bit. They currently advertise 2660 feet per second out of a 24-inch long barrel, 300-grain bullet. I have personally observed 2500 to 2550 out of a 20-inch long barrel. So the 375 Ruger is faster than the 375 H&H when both are fired from 24-inch long barrels. 375 Ruger basically duplicates the performance of the 375 H&H out of a 20-inch long barrel. Now, lowering that velocity of factory ammo and adding weight to the rifle makes a big difference. Now, I have done a lot of hunting, both with that Ruger Safari Magnum and with various iterations of the Ruger Hawkeye. So first off, I do not like the trigger on the Ruger Safari Magnum. I think the trigger is very stiff and it has lots of creep. It is something you can get used to with enough practice, but it is a challenging transition for someone that is not used to a trigger like that. For instance, I hunted bison in Colorado several years ago, and I was paired with another guy for that part of the hunt. He had an issue with his rifle. He needed to use mine, so I was happy to lend him my Ruger Safari Magnum and 375. Will, just due to the nature of things in the heat of the moment and all of that, we didn't have any time for him to practice with that rifle before he went and tried to shoot a bison with it. And his first time he ever squeezed the trigger on that rifle was when it was pointed at a bison. And it was a much longer, stiffer trigger than he was used to. And his first shot hit the ground about 6 feet in front of that buffalo. Fortunately, he got another shot and was able to adjust once he realized how different that trigger was from his rifle. He made a great shot. The buffalo went down, and that was the end of that. Now, the Ruger Hawkeye has a different trigger that I much prefer to the old one on the Safari Magnum. Now, a Timney or a Trigger Tech trigger is certainly nicer than the stock Ruger trigger, but the LC6 on current production Hawkeye rifles, massive improvement on the old M77 Mk II trigger, at least in my opinion. Now, another thing I do not like about the Ruger Hawkeye is that the actions are not known for being smooth. Brand new from the factory, many Ruger Hawkeye actions feel like they have gravel in them. I'm exaggerating, but just a little bit. This is something you can fix, put a little bit of polishing compound on the action, work the bolt back and forth for an hour or so, and that action will be considerably smoother after you do that. But I'm not the sort of guy that likes to work on rifles after I buy them if I can get away with it. We're not talking about a $300 or $400 budget rifle here. These are rifles that cost $1,000 or more, and I feel like a rifle at that price point should work well straight out of the box without me having to do anything to it. That's not the case with the Ruger Safari Magnum. I wouldn't say it runs like butter, not like an old Craig Jorgensen or something like that, but it is a very smooth, easy to operate action, considerably nicer than the Hawkeye in that respect. Next, this is a minor point, but it is worth noting that I feel like the bolt handle on the Ruger Safari Magnum is a little bit too small in relation to the size of the stock on it. It is possible that when you're excited and in a hurry, that could interfere with your operation of the bolt. That's not the case with the Ruger Hawkeye, though. Like I said, minor point, but keep that in mind. Now, your mileage may vary with this, but I really like the integrated scope bases that are built into the receiver for both Ruger rifles. You need proprietary rings to operate with them, but you can get them from places like Leupold, for instance. I think that the integrated scope bases make it easier to mount a scope low above the bore in contrast to a lot of the rails many more modern rifles have these days. But on the other hand, Picatinny rails sure are convenient. It makes it easier to swap scopes between rifles. I switch scopes back and forth between rifles a lot, so Picatinny rails make that convenient, but those integrated scope bases are nice for a rifle you're going to mount a scope on and forget about, like most people do. That is what I've done with all my Rugers. I have 4 of them. I have 3 different Hawkeye rifles and that Ruger Safari Magnum. In each case, I put a scope on it, and that scope, once I got it, tightened and dialed in and all that stuff, I never take it off. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the Ruger Safari Magnum is heavy with a capital H. That really dampens recoil, but it makes it much tougher to carry. And because the barrel on my rifle is so long, and because that is such a thick, heavy barrel, the rifle balances a little bit far forward. It's not terrible. I don't hate it, but it is still an issue. That's less of an issue with the Hawkeye. Now, the Hawkeye overall is much lighter. I think it's on the light side for the big Magnums. I think it's fine in 9.3x62. 375 H&H is borderline. I think the .416 Ruger is too much for most people to handle, especially in that rifle. Now, to counteract this, Ruger includes a muzzle brake kit on most of their rifles in these chamberings. And when I say kit, I mean it comes with a removable muzzle brake that you can take off and replace with a muzzle weight. The idea is that you practice with the muzzle brake, get used to shooting it like that, sight it in like that. Then if you're on a guided hunt and you don't want to blast the eardrums of everyone next to you, you can take off the brake, add the weight to it instead. Point of impact won't change, and recoil will be more, but you're not going to be paying as much attention to that in the heat of the moment, hunting, all of that stuff. But it'll also be less bad for everyone around you. I have used that system a lot. I've found that the muzzle brake does really work well, really reduces perceived recoil, but it is loud. I have a 300 Win Mag that I have fired a couple of times with that muzzle brake on without ear protection, and I really regret doing that. And that's just me behind the rifle. It is terrible for guides and professional hunters and whatnot that may be standing off to the side of you when you shoot. For instance, Kubis, one of my PHs in Africa, had a client that brought a Ruger Hawkeye African in 375 Ruger. Guy was using it on the hunt, didn't want to take his muzzle brake off. He fired his rifle in a situation, let's just say, where Kubis was not ready for him to shoot, and it was a little too close to Kubis's head when it went off, and Kubis said his ears rang for about 3 weeks after that hunt. So like I said, that brake is terrible on people that are with you, and the weight works okay. I've noticed a small but acceptable shift in point of impact when you go between the weight and the brake, but you have to use it. Now, to that end, the barrel is threaded on most, if not all, Ruger Hawkeyes. That's not the case with the old Ruger Safari Magnum. A suppressor works wonderful with the Ruger guide gun in particular. You get a substantial improvement with recoil without the extra muzzle blast you get from a muzzle brake. The first suppressed rifle I ever shot was that Ruger guide gun in 375 Ruger. Changed my life. Now, that guide gun only has a 20-inch long barrel, so adding a suppressor to it doesn't make it excessively long and bulky. The Hawkeye African has a 23-inch long barrel. You can put a suppressor on it. People do. It's just bigger when you do that. Our clients in Africa have taken piles and piles of animals with that Ruger guide gun in 375 Ruger. They seem to have fixed the problems with the stock, too. Johan said his did crack, but after he put 3,000 rounds through it after about 5 years of hunting. He fixed it, and it is still trucking along 5 years after that. Now, like I mentioned earlier, there is a magazine size difference between these rifles. The Hawkeye has a 3-round capacity in so-called Magnum cartridges, 375 Ruger, .416 Ruger, even 300 Win Mag. It has a 4-round capacity for standard rounds, 9.3, 30-06, etc. Ruger Safari Magnum has a 4-round capacity. And remember, that rifle was only available in Magnum cartridges, so 375, .416, .458. So in this case, the Ruger Safari Magnum has either the same or slightly larger magazine capacity than the Ruger Hawkeye. Now, in my opinion, the Ruger guide gun has a magazine that is less than ideal in size for hunting buffalo. You can do it. People do it. We've had hunters do it. We've had hunters use that guide gun on buffalo, like I told you earlier. We have primarily used it for plains game in the past for that reason, though. We got the magazine extension to it, so it went from 3 to 4 rounds. That's great. But we also have that CZ550 in camp with a 5-round capacity, and that is generally what we use for buffalo hunting. Now, for what it's worth, if I didn't mention it earlier, my 9.3x62 Ruger Hawkeye has a 22-inch long barrel. So that rifle is shorter, lighter, and handier than my Safari Magnum in 375 H&H, which has a 24-inch long barrel. Both rifles are very reliable. I have not had issues with either one. Both are controlled round feed. Both work when the chips are down. I've heard stories of people having malfunctions with the Safari Magnum when the action is run too fast. I have not experienced that myself. Accuracy with both rifles is outstanding. And like I mentioned earlier, I own several Ruger Hawkeyes in different chamberings. Accuracy on those has ranged from good to excellent, depending on exactly which one I'm talking about. The Ruger Safari Magnum is surprisingly accurate as well. I don't know what was going on with those rifles, but everything about them was really nice, to include their accuracy. And every single type of 375 H&H ammo I've fired out of that rifle has been close to or sub MOA. The different Hawkeyes, on average, have not been quite as good, but accuracy not bad with them at all. And my Hawkeye 9.3x62 shoots outstanding. I have had 3-shot groups at 200 yards where all the bullets are almost touching with that rifle. But that rifle also does not have a factory barrel on it either. But say, for instance, my 300 Win Mag. I've shot lots and lots of ammo through that rifle over the past 10 years that I've owned it. It doesn't shoot anything bad. Nothing is great with it. Most everything is around 1.5 MOA. That rifle actually loves Barnes ammo and shoots it right at 1 MOA. Now, a Ruger Safari Magnum is great if you can find it, but they are rare and they are expensive. I found exactly one on Gunbroker as I was doing my research for this episode, $3,400. The Hawkeye is much more common. Ruger still makes them, not 9.3x62, but in all sorts of other cartridges, and 375 Ruger is their number one rifle that Ruger makes for those that want to hunt dangerous game. You can find those brand new, $1,400. Now, for reference, the Model 70, new production Model 70s and 375 H&H I mentioned earlier, they are quite a bit more expensive when you can find them, say around $2,000 thereabouts, and they're not nearly as widely available as those Ruger Hawkeyes are. So for all those reasons, a Ruger Hawkeye, either a Hawkeye African or a guide gun, is the choice for a controlled feed action rifle suitable for hunting dangerous game these days. Okay, folks, this has been a long episode. I've been talking for almost an hour and 45 minutes at this point, talking about the 9.3x62 and the 375 H&H and these two different rifles. I really like both cartridges. I've hunted with both a lot. Both will serve you really well hunting in Africa or for almost anything else in the world. And either one, I think, would be a perfect choice for someone that wanted a single rifle to hunt the broadest spectrum of game possible. And like I said, there's a tremendous amount of overlap between them, between deer, antelope, up to and including thick-skinned dangerous game. And the 375 maybe skews a little bigger than the 9.3, which skews a little smaller. But for the most part, if you use good bullets and you place your shots appropriately, they're going to work great for you. My personal preference is the 9.3x62, but that's just me. You're welcome to disagree with me, and I would not tell anyone that preferred the 375 H&H that they were wrong for feeling that way. And truth be told, there's nothing that I would hunt with one cartridge that I would not hunt with the other one either. If you're listening on Spotify, answer the poll for this episode. Which cartridge do you prefer out of these two, the 9.3x62 or the 375? And also leave a comment if you're watching on YouTube or listening to this on Spotify. Let me know what you think about this stuff too. Now, if all of this talk about hunting in Africa has inspired you to book a hunt for yourself, I would love to set you up with your dream safari for buffalo, for plains game, or for both in South Africa's Limpopo province. You're welcome to bring a rifle, a 9.3x62, or 375 H&H, or another appropriate cartridge if you have one you want to bring, or you can use one of our camp rifles. The hunting is fantastic there. You're going to have a great time. I will help you with all of the pain points, to include doing the paperwork to bring your rifle into the country. So email me, john@thebiggamehuntingblog.com, or visit bestsafarihunt.com for more details. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to thebiggamehuntingblog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.